Every morning, the sound of little feet echoed down the hall of the nursery, a place where children were supposed to feel safe, loved, and nurtured. For most of the children, it was a place of joy, where laughter filled the air and friendships blossomed. But for one young girl, every day was a nightmare that seemed to repeat itself endlessly. Her heart would race as she entered the classroom, her stomach a tangled knot of fear. She never knew what would set off the teacher's temper, but she knew the tears would come. For weeks, this girl endured cruel words, sharp glares, and harsh punishments, all at the hands of a woman who was supposed to care for her. The nursery teacher, someone the children trusted, had become the source of daily torment. Her actions were subtle at first, soft, biting comments disguised as constructive criticism. But soon, they escalated. Each day the girl would walk in, her head down, eyes cast to the floor, trying to shrink into herself. She didn't know how to make it stop, nor could she understand why it was happening. All she knew was that it hurt. Every single day. But there was one person who noticed. A friend who saw the silent tears, who recognized the pain behind the forced smiles. This friend, with a heart full of empathy, couldn't stand to watch it any longer. They had seen the way the teacher treated their classmate, always harsher with her, always picking her apart. The little girl would try to hide it, but her friend could see through the cracks. It was like watching a beautiful painting slowly being ruined, one brushstroke at a time. One day, as the girl sat in the corner of the classroom, wiping away yet another tear, her friend made a decision that would change everything. Without thinking twice, they grabbed their phone and dialed 911. A simple call, but it was one that would shatter the silence and open the door to something bigger. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As the sirens wailed in the distance, the girl sat frozen, not fully understanding what was happening. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing. Why was her friend doing this? Would it make everything better? Or would it make things worse? The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, thick with tension. The teacher was unaware, still going about her day, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. And in the next moments, everything would change. For the teacher, for the girl, and for everyone who had been living in the shadow of silence. But as the sirens got closer, the question remained. Would this be the end of the torment? Or was it just the beginning of something even darker? The answers would come, but not yet. Not until the truth was finally revealed, and the consequences of that single 911 call played out in ways no one could have ever imagined. The screech of the sirens grew louder, but it didn't register for the teacher at first. She was still at the front of the room, giving out instructions, completely unaware of the unfolding situation. She had always been strict, but in her mind, she was just doing her job, disciplining, guiding, keeping control of a group of young minds. However, to the children who sat under her gaze, it felt like something more sinister. For the girl who had suffered the most, the daily rituals of humiliation had become almost routine. Each word from the teacher cut deeper. Each look from her sent a chill through her spine. It wasn't just the constant reprimands. It was the way the teacher made her feel like she didn't belong. As if she were some kind of failure in the teacher's eyes. She was the quiet one, the shy one, the one who never quite measured up to the teacher's high expectations. Nothing she did was ever good enough. Her friend, however, was different. They were the type of person who always spoke up when things weren't right. They didn't sit back and accept things as they were. While the girl sat quietly in her corner, trying to stay invisible, her friend could never turn a blind eye to injustice. They had seen how the teacher treated the other kids, but it was the girl who bore the brunt of the cruelty. They watched as the teacher's smile turned into something crueler, as her tone of voice became sharper with every passing day. It wasn't just discipline, it was personal, and the friend couldn't take it any longer. There had been times when the girl tried to confide in her friend, small whispers in the hallway when the teacher wasn't around, quick glances when no one was looking. "I don't want to go back tomorrow," she would say. I don't know why she doesn't like me." Her voice was small, quiet, filled with a sadness that seemed too heavy for someone so young. Her friend didn't know what to say. They didn't know why the teacher was like that, but they could see the pain, the hurt that the girl carried every day. And it weighed on their heart, knowing they couldn't do much about it at the time. But seeing their friend's tears, watching the girl's spirit slowly fade behind those tear-streaked cheeks, made them realize something needed to change. The thought had been in their mind for a while. But that day, when the tears came once again, the friend knew they couldn't stand by any longer. When the girl sat in the corner, her small hands wiping away yet another tear, the friend took action. With trembling fingers, they pulled out their phone. At first, they hesitated. Was this the right thing to do? Would they make things worse? But deep down, they knew that if they didn't do something, nothing would ever change. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, steady, almost detached. The friend barely heard the words as they spilled out. Something about needing help, something about a teacher who might be causing harm. But the message was clear. The police needed to know. Back in the classroom, the teacher was still unaware. She didn't hear the phone call. She didn't see the quiet exchange between the two friends. She didn't notice the way the girl's eyes were red from crying. But something was different today. It was the weight in the air, the feeling that something was about to shift. The sirens grew closer, and it wasn't until the door to the classroom swung open with a force that echoed through the room that the teacher's calm demeanor finally cracked. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, his presence commanding the attention of every child in the room. He didn't say anything at first, just looked around, scanning the classroom with a quiet, careful gaze. His eyes flicked from the children to the teacher, then to the girl sitting quietly at her desk. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his voice low and steady. The teacher stood up from her desk, her face momentarily pale. "I'm sorry, officer, is something wrong? We're just in the middle of a lesson." The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the children, his eyes landing on the girl who had been the target of so much unnoticed pain. She shrank back, her face flushed with embarrassment. The officer noticed it, the way she clutched her arms tightly, the way she refused to meet anyone's gaze. "Can you come with me for a moment?" the officer asked, nodding toward the girl. The teacher's face darkened. "What's this about? Why do you need her?" The officer's eyes never wavered. "I think she's the one who can answer that question for us." The room was silent. Every child was still, unsure of what was happening. The teacher's face twisted with confusion and frustration, but she didn't argue. Not yet. The girl slowly stood up from her seat, her legs shaky beneath her, her heart hammered in her chest, and her mind spun with questions. What was going on? Why was the officer here? What had she done wrong? The officer led her outside, gently guiding her away from the classroom. Her friend followed closely behind, their eyes wide with worry. They couldn't help but feel a knot of fear in their own stomach. They had made the call, but what would happen now? Would the teacher get in trouble? Would things change for their friend? They didn't know, and in that moment, it felt like everything was hanging in the balance. As they reached the hallway, the officer knelt down to her level. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "We're here to help you." The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the weight lifting from her shoulders, just a little. For the first time, in a long time, someone was asking her if she was okay. Her friend stood nearby, their hand resting on her shoulder for support. They hadn't said much, but their presence was enough. The girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. The officer turned to the friend. "What's been happening?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. The friend hesitated, glancing at the girl before speaking. "It's the teacher. She's been so mean to her. Every day, she makes her cry." The words came out in a rush, spilling over as the friend recounted everything they had witnessed. "It's been going on for weeks. I didn't know what to do. but I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to call. The officer nodded, his expression serious. You did the right thing, he said, his voice reassuring. We'll take it from here. The tension in the hallway seemed to dissipate slightly, but the questions lingered. What would happen next? What would this mean for the girl, for her friend, for the teacher? Would the truth come out? Would anyone believe what had been going on in that classroom? The clock was ticking, but no one knew how much time was left before everything would finally unravel. The officer stood quietly for a moment, looking between the girl and her friend. There was a heaviness in the air that neither of them could shake. The girl still didn't fully understand what was happening, and her friend was struggling to keep the panic from overwhelming them. This was supposed to make things better, but now that the moment had arrived, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the teacher appeared at the end of the corridor, her face red with frustration and confusion. She walked toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, but there was an undeniable sense of unease in her steps. The officer stood his ground, his presence calm but unwavering. He didn't move as she approached, his eyes never leaving her face. Is there a problem here, officer? She asked, her voice a little too sharp, her eyes darting between the girl and the friend. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the girl and then back at the teacher. You've been reported, he said simply. The teacher's face twisted in disbelief. Reported? For what? For the way you've been treating the children in your class, the officer replied. Specifically, how you've been treating this young girl. There was a pause. The teacher's eyes flickered, and for a moment, the tension in the hallway felt suffocating. The girl held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was so small, so quiet, that it felt impossible that anyone would believe what had been happening to her. She glanced at her friend, who was standing just behind her, their hands still gently resting on her shoulder. I don't know what you're talking about, the teacher said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm a teacher. I discipline the children so they can learn. Discipline? The officer repeated, his voice low. What kind of discipline involves making a child cry every day? What kind of discipline causes fear and anxiety instead of growth and safety? The teacher's face reddened. That's not what's happening here. She snapped, her voice rising. I've done nothing wrong. These children are just sensitive. I'm doing my job. The officer took a step closer, his tone unyielding. We'll be the ones to determine that. And we have reports that say otherwise. So I suggest you calm down and let us do our job. The teacher opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered toward the girl again, and for the first time, the girl saw something shift in her expression. Was it guilt? Fear? The teacher quickly masked it with a forced smile, but the girl wasn't fooled. She had seen that smile many times before, right before she was berated for the smallest mistake. The tension was thick, unbearable. The hallway felt too small for everything that was unfolding. The girl could feel her heart beating in her throat, and every instinct in her told her to run, to hide, but her friend was there, holding her steady. And somehow, that was enough. Can you tell us what's been happening? The officer asked, turning back to the girl. The girl's voice wavered as she spoke, the words barely above a whisper. She yells at me all the time. She tells me I'm doing everything wrong. She says I'm not good enough. The officer's expression softened, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak at her own pace, giving her the space to open up. I try to be good, but it's never enough. She makes me feel like I'm worthless. The girl's eyes welled up with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. She didn't want to cry again. Not now, not in front of the officer. She just wanted it all to stop. Her friend squeezed her shoulder. You don't have to keep going if it's too hard, they whispered, but the girl shook her head. She needed to say it. She needed someone to know what had been happening. The teacher stood off to the side, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't speak, but her gaze followed every word the girl said. The officer looked at her, "Is this true?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The teacher's lips pressed together in a thin line. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. "I've had to be tough on them," she said, her voice shaky. "These kids today, they don't listen. They need discipline. They need structure." "Discipline," the officer repeated, his brow furrowing. "Or is it control? And what kind of structure includes making a child feel like they're constantly failing?" The teacher recoiled, her face flushing a deep red. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get stuck. The officer stood his ground, not allowing her to deflect, not allowing her to make excuses. The girl felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. The officer wasn't done yet, and neither was the teacher. There was still so much that hadn't been said. The silence in the hallway felt deafening as everyone waited for the next move. The girl couldn't look at the teacher anymore. She couldn't bear to see the woman's face, the woman who had made her feel so small for so long. Her gaze drifted to the floor, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't fully process. What would happen to the teacher? Would she lose her job? What would her parents say? Her friend squeezed her hand, and the gentle pressure was a comfort, even as the tension thickened. It wasn't over yet. There was so much more that needed to come out, so many layers that needed to be peeled away. The room felt like it was closing in, and the girl wasn't sure if she was ready to face what would happen next. The officer finally broke the silence. "We'll be taking this further," he said, his voice serious. "We need to gather all the details and make sure we understand everything fully. And that will take time. But for now, I suggest you both stay here, and we'll handle the rest." The teacher's expression twisted. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but no sound came out. She looked like a cornered animal, her composure slipping with every passing second. The girl stood frozen, her hands still clenched tightly, trying to keep herself together, trying not to crumble under the weight of everything that was happening. The officer turned to the girl and her friend. "Thank you for your courage," he said quietly. "You did the right thing. And now things are going to change." But even as he spoke, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that things were just beginning to unravel. What was going to happen next? How much of the truth would be revealed? And would it be enough to stop the torment once and for all? The officer's words echoed in the hallway, but despite the reassurance, something felt off. The girl couldn't shake the anxiety in her chest. Every moment that passed made her feel like she was in the eye of a storm, a calm before the chaos. Her friend's grip on her hand tightened, and she could sense the same nervous energy radiating from them. They had done the right thing, they knew that, but the uncertainty lingered. What would happen now? Was the teacher really going to be held accountable? Would they be believed? As the officer turned to speak with the principal, the girl's heart raced. She wanted answers, but there was no way to prepare for what would come next. The hallway was too quiet now, the heavy silence almost suffocating. Then something unexpected happened. A sudden loud voice broke through the stillness. "You can't do this." The teacher's shout made the girl flinch, and she instinctively pulled her friend closer, almost as if to shield them from what might happen next. The teacher was standing near the doorway of the principal's office, her face twisted in a mixture of anger and desperation. "I won't let you ruin my career over a lie." Her voice was high-pitched, laced with panic, as she rushed toward the officer. The officer turned slowly, his expression impassive, but there was a glimmer of suspicion in his eyes. "It's not a lie," he said, his tone hardening. "We've heard enough. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're going to need to speak with the children and gather all the information we can." "No," the teacher's voice cracked. "This is all a misunderstanding. This girl, she's trouble. She lies. She's manipulative." Her words were quick, almost frantic, as though she were grasping at anything that could save her. "I've been nothing but professional, but she's always causing problems in the classroom. This is just her trying to get back at me." The girl's blood ran cold. The teacher's words were like a punch to the gut. She hadn't expected this kind of retaliation. The teacher was spinning a story, making it seem like she was the victim, and that the girl had been nothing but trouble. It was a lie, a cruel and hurtful lie, and the girl felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. But the officer didn't waver. "I suggest you calm down and let us do our job," he said again, but there was a firmness in his voice that hadn't been there before. The teacher's eyes darted to the principal's office, where the door was slightly ajar. The girl could see the principal inside, talking quietly to another officer. It was clear that the situation was escalating, but she couldn't quite grasp the full picture. Something wasn't adding up. Her friend squeezed her hand again, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I don't think this is over," they whispered. The girl could barely hear them, her thoughts still swirling with confusion and dread. The teacher's eyes flickered with something dark, something the girl had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was desperation, fear. And then suddenly, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the hallway, her footsteps quick and sharp. The girl was left standing there, her mind racing. What was going on? What had just happened? Before she could make sense of it, the principal emerged from the office, her face unusually serious. She looked from the officer to the girl and her friend. "I need you both to come with me," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. The girl's heart skipped a beat. What now? Had the teacher convinced the principal that everything was a lie? Was the truth going to be buried before it could come to light? The principal led them into her office, closing the door behind them. The officer remained outside, standing guard, as if he too was beginning to realize that something was amiss. The principal sat down at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look directly at the girl at first. Instead, she stared at the papers in front of her. Then, finally, she spoke. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said quietly, "but I need you to understand something." The girl's stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't going the way she had hoped. "You see," the principal continued, her voice almost too calm, "we have to take all accusations seriously. But there are things you need to know. The teacher you're accusing, she's been here for years. She's well respected by the other parents and staff. And I'm afraid there's a lot of people who don't believe this is as clear-cut as you think." The girl blinked, stunned. "What do you mean?" Her voice felt small, as if the weight of the words was already pushing her down. The principal sighed, her gaze softening, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "What I mean is, the teacher isn't the only one with a story to tell. There are people who believe you're just a troublemaker. There's evidence, you see, of a pattern of behavior in your past." The girl's mind reeled. "What evidence? I've never been a troublemaker. I never." The principal interrupted, her tone growing more serious. "There are complaints about your behavior, your attitude toward authority. There are parents and teachers who have questioned whether you're truly a reliable witness. And there are some people who think you might be exaggerating things. I'm afraid there's no easy way to say this, but we need to take those concerns seriously, too." The room seemed to spin. The girl's heart slammed against her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The principal's words didn't make sense. Was this a setup? Had they already decided the girl wasn't telling the truth before the investigation had even begun? She felt her friend's grip on her hand tighten, as if they were trying to pull her back from the edge. "This isn't right," her friend whispered, though their voice trembled with fear. "You've done nothing wrong." But the girl wasn't sure anymore. The principal's words hung heavy in the air, and doubt began to creep in, inching its way into her thoughts. She'd never been in trouble before, never lied about anything like this. But now, it felt like the entire world was shifting beneath her feet. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the office opened again, and the officer stepped in, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes scanning the room quickly. He turned to the principal. "There's something you need to see, and we don't have much time." The principal's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is it?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He looked at the girl and her friend, his face tight with concern. "It's the teacher. We got something here that changes everything." The girl's breath caught in her throat. What could it be? What had the officer found? Had he uncovered something that would finally prove her story? But the officer's next words left the girl frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. The officer's words cut through the tension like a blade. "We found something," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, the question swirling in her mind. What had he found? Had he discovered something that would prove she was telling the truth? The officer pulled out his phone and held it up, showing the screen to the principal. There, displayed clearly, was a series of text messages. The girl's eyes widened as she recognized the name on the screen. It was the teacher's name, but what made her blood run cold was the content of the messages. The teacher had been texting someone from outside the school. The messages were harsh, full of anger and disdain for the children she was supposed to be teaching. She had spoken about the girl specifically, calling her names and accusing her of being a problem child, even going as far as to say she didn't belong in the class. But it wasn't just the words that struck the girl deeply. It was the tone, the venom that had seeped through every word. These weren't just disciplinary concerns. They were personal attacks. The teacher had been harboring a deep-seated resentment, and now the proof was right in front of them. The officer's voice broke the silence. "We've confirmed it. These texts were sent from the teacher's personal phone. She's been using her position of power to manipulate and belittle you. And now we have the evidence to prove it." The girl could hardly breathe. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but the relief was short-lived. She still couldn't fully process what was happening, what this meant for the teacher. The officer had found something that could end the torment once and for all, but the magnitude of it felt overwhelming. The principal looked at the screen, her face hardening as she read through the messages. There was no denying it now. The teacher had crossed a line, and it wasn't just a matter of classroom discipline. It was personal. The girl felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was tempered by something else, a sense of sadness, maybe even pity. The teacher had been hiding this darkness, and now it was exposed for the world to see. The principal's voice was quiet but firm. "You'll be removed from the school immediately," she said to the teacher, her words final. "We'll be contacting the authorities to ensure this is handled properly." The teacher's face twisted in fury. "You can't do this. This is all lies. You're all just trying to ruin me." Her voice cracked as she stepped forward, but the officer stood his ground, blocking her path. "You're done," the officer said, his tone unwavering. "You've crossed the line, and now you'll face the consequences." The teacher's face reddened with rage, but for once, the girl didn't feel afraid. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had control. The teacher had tried to break her, to make her feel small and insignificant, but now the truth had come out. With the teacher escorted out of the office, the girl was left standing there, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Her friends stood beside her, their hands still on her shoulder, offering the silent comfort that spoke volumes. The officer turned to the girl. "You did the right thing. It took a lot of courage to speak up." The girl nodded, but her mind was still racing. She had wanted this. She had wanted the teacher to face consequences. But now that it was happening, it felt surreal. She didn't know what would happen next, what kind of fallout this would cause. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Her life was about to change forever. As the officer left the room to finalize the details with the principal, the girl and her friend were left alone in the office. There was a strange stillness, as if the world had paused for just a moment, allowing them to catch their breath. And then, just as the girl thought it was all over, the door opened again. The principal stepped in, her face pale, her expression grim. "I need to talk to you both," she said, her voice low. The girl's stomach twisted with unease. Had the teacher managed to turn the situation around? Was the principal going to change her mind? I just got off the phone with the authorities. The principal continued, her voice tight. And there's something you need to know. We've uncovered something else. The girl felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Her heart sank. What now? The principal said slowly. She wasn't working alone. The words hit like a punch. The girl's mind spun. What was she saying? What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The principal took a deep breath, her eyes searching the girl's face. We've discovered that the teacher had been part of a larger scheme. She wasn't just targeting you. She had been manipulating other students, creating fear and intimidation in multiple classes, using her authority to control them. And it goes further than that. The girl's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. This couldn't be happening. The principal continued, was involved in a larger network of educators who were using fear as a means of control. There have been complaints about this pattern before, but until now, no one knew how far it went. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of this new revelation sunk in. The girl wasn't just a victim of one bad teacher. There was something much darker lurking behind it all. We don't know the full extent yet, the principal said, but this could go much deeper than anyone ever imagined. The girl couldn't comprehend it. It was too much. The teacher wasn't just cruel. She was part of something much bigger, something sinister. And now, the girl had not only brought down her abuser, but had unwittingly exposed a web of corruption that spanned far beyond what she could have ever imagined. Her mind was racing, trying to piece it all together, but as the principal spoke, the girl realized that this was far from over. The battle wasn't won yet, and the fight for justice was only beginning. What had started as a small act of courage had now unraveled a much larger conspiracy, and the girl knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The girl sat in the principal's office, her mind still reeling from the revelation. The teacher, someone she had once feared, was part of a much darker network of control. The more the principal spoke, the harder it was to digest. It felt like the entire world had shifted under her feet, and nothing seemed familiar anymore. What had begun as a single act of courage had led to an unraveling of something far more complex, far more dangerous. As the principal continued her explanation, the girl could barely concentrate. All she could think about was how many other children had suffered, how many others had been silenced by fear, just like she had been. Her own voice, finally raised in the face of the injustice she'd endured, had brought down more than just one person. It had started to uncover a dark truth hidden in plain sight. When the officer returned, his expression was more solemn than before. "We've already started an investigation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is bigger than we thought, and we're not going to stop until we get to the bottom of it. Rest assured, you'll be protected." The girl didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe it was finally over, that the nightmare of her days in the nursery was behind her. But she also knew that the road ahead would be long. The truth had been exposed, but there was still much work to be done. The teacher would face consequences, but that wouldn't undo the harm she had caused. Her friend squeezed her hand, offering the silent comfort they had provided since the beginning. It was in moments like these that the girl realized how important their support had been. Without their call to 911, without their unwavering belief in her, none of this would have been possible. She had needed someone to stand with her, to believe in her truth. And now she had finally found the strength to speak up. As the officers and principal made their plans for the next steps, the girl couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led her here. She thought about the times she had been made to feel small, the cruel words and actions that had chipped away at her sense of self-worth. But now, standing at the center of a wave of change, she realized that none of it had been her fault. She had been a victim, and the truth was powerful enough to set her free. Later that day, the girl went home, still processing everything that had happened. Her family, who had been unaware of the full extent of the abuse, were in shock. They listened carefully as she explained what had transpired, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted the ordeal. They comforted her, assuring her that she was safe now, that the teacher's actions would be held accountable. But even in the comfort of her home, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation unfolded slowly. The teacher's actions were revealed to be part of a much larger pattern, one that involved multiple educators across the district. The authorities were diligent, working to ensure that no stone was left unturned. The girl's bravery had sparked something far greater than she could have imagined. And soon, more students came forward with their own stories. Some had been too afraid to speak before, but with the girl's courage shining a light on the truth, they found their voices too. The community began to heal, but it would take time. The girl's life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. She had a new sense of confidence, a new sense of strength. The echoes of her pain were still there, but they were quieter now, no longer defining her. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her life, and though the journey was far from over, she knew she was no longer alone in it. She thought about her friend, the one who had made that call to 911. Without them, everything could have turned out differently. They had been the catalyst, the one who acted when everything seemed hopeless. And though they had faced their own fears and doubts, together, they had made a difference. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was hope, and sometimes, all it took was one person to shine a light. In the months that followed, the girl began to speak out more about her experience. She joined others in raising awareness about the importance of speaking up against abuse, about the power of standing together. She knew that her story was only one of many, but it was a start, and that mattered. The teacher, as promised, faced the full weight of the consequences. The investigation revealed that she had been part of a larger, systemic issue within the school. Many other victims came forward, each story echoing the same pattern of control and manipulation. The teacher was arrested, and her career was permanently ended, but the girl knew that justice was never as simple as punishment. True justice would be the healing of the children she had hurt, the restoration of trust that had been broken. Over time, the girl learned to forgive herself. She had spent so long believing that she wasn't worthy of being heard, that she wasn't strong enough to stand up. But in the end, she realized that the courage she had found in herself was what had made all the difference. It wasn't about being perfect or fearless. It was about refusing to let fear control her life. And so, as she moved forward, she carried with her the knowledge that her voice mattered. That truth, no matter how difficult, could lead to change. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. And that made all the difference. The school, too, began to change. New policies were put in place to prevent further abuse, to ensure that no child would have to face what the girl had endured. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a start, and it was something. For the girl, knowing that she had helped bring about that change made every step of the journey worth it. She had learned that sometimes, the most important battles aren't fought alone. They're fought with the support of those who believe in you, who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And that's a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the years passed, the girl looked back on that moment with pride. It had been one of the hardest, most painful experiences of her life, but it had also been the turning point. The moment when she found her voice, when she refused to let fear silence her. And in doing so, she had changed her own life, and the lives of many others, forever.